Greetings, Bermuda. My name is Aaron Hill. Again, I'm joined by my good friend and brother, Mr. Ryan Robinson, Perinchief. Ryan, how are you?
I'm good, Aaron, and as always, it's great to be on the Burn News COVID-19 special series with you and our special guests and listeners.
Yes, Ryan. So, it's been 2 days since we had our last interview with Dr. Brathwaite, and since it was International Nurses Day, I thought that was a really, really interesting interview with Dr. Brathwaite. It seems as if we've been blessed with a special panel of guests, a series of guests. We've got a hot one again today. We had, prior to Dr. Brathwaite, we had Mr. Glenn Jones, who's the interim CEO of the BTA, followed by the CEO of the Bermuda Health Council. I think we're doing a fairly good job.
I think so too. And I mean, Tuesday's show with the nurses for International Nurses Day was really a breath of fresh air, I think. We got to talk with Dr. Brathwaite about some pretty big topics like universal health care and taking care of the uninsured and government macro policy. But then we also got to sort of have a very frank and heartfelt conversation with some of the nurses and the people on the front lines. So it's been going well. I got a lot of good feedback from the last show, and we're looking forward to today's one. So as we said, I mean, today we have a very special guest, and that is none other than the Honorable Curtis Dickinson, JP MP, the Minister of Finance. So we're continuing right along with some pretty heavy hitters here to talk about responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and how we navigate this forward. So we're definitely looking forward to having the Honorable Finance Minister Curtis Dickinson on with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Aaron, to introduce him.
Yes, Ryan. Well, before we do that, as it's been customary during the course of our show, we'd like to express our condolences to the families of the 8 Bermudians who tragically lost their lives due to the pandemic. And again, extend our best wishes to those who are still suffering from the virus. And again, express our thanks, our greatest gratitude to those essential workers, like, for example, the nurses that we've had on our last series, who are out there on the front lines protecting us from this.
Thank you for that reminder. I mean, I don't think we've had any more deaths since the last show, which is a good thing, but we also want to send our heartfelt sympathies to those who are recovering as well. So thank you for that important reminder.
Absolutely. But without further ado, because I think all of our guests that we've had, they've got other things to do, very important things to do. So we're grateful for them for taking out the time.
It's definitely an honor.
But we don't want to take any more time before we head right into getting our special guests on today. And we're going to have joining us live momentarily the Minister of Finance, the Honorable Curtis Dickinson. Minister, how are you?
Good afternoon, Aaron. Good afternoon, Ryan. How are you doing? I'm well, thanks.
Good. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Now, I think we may have some technical difficulties today just for our listening audience. There may be a slight delay. It gives the minister some more time to answer our questions. So that's perfectly fine. But keep that in mind. So you can start with any questions. We'll ask our questions. But I know that the minister's on a tight schedule, so we can roll right through. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, Minister, the first question is, how are you sitting down? It appears that you're in the hot seat as Minister of Finance to figure out how we're going to recover from this pandemic. You have an unenviable job, and we hope to discuss during the course of this interview some of the things that you have to do. But Ryan, I think it'd probably be appropriate to start off with, I think yesterday, Minister, correct me if I'm wrong, legislation was passed allowing some members of the community to draw down from their pension. If you could just give us a brief overview, a snapshot of what that legislation encapsulates and why it is that you felt that was necessary now.
Okay, so on Friday, we passed legislation to allow for a one-time $12,000 withdrawal from people's private pensions. I'm happy to report that yesterday the Senate actually passed the same legislation. And so now it's off to the governor to have him sign it, which we expect will happen fairly shortly. The idea behind allowing people to tap into their pensions is people are unemployed, having their hours reduced as a result of the pandemic and the shutdown of businesses as a result of the shelter-in-place orders that were happened during the month of April. The government has put in place an unemployment program, benefits program, to try to help provide for those folks who have lost work. But government can't do it all by itself. And so our thinking, let's try to provide people with some options where they can kind of tap into some of their own money. So the $12,000 gives persons the ability to kind of access their pensions and use that money however they deem appropriate. Our hope is that those who actually have the need will avail themselves to the opportunity, and those who don't will let their money sit and grow. It was a very difficult decision to take because The whole idea behind pensions is to save for your retirement. Having said that, we want to be sure that people actually can live their lives. And in as much as they're having a hardship, we have to be able to provide for them to be able to tap into that saved money.
Now, with that being said, Minister, I think it's definitely a good thing. It allows people to sort of take money from their future selves, but it also avoids them from having to maybe perhaps take out a loan or do something which might bring on some other types of risk. But I'm curious, has the government, in making this decision, considered sort of what that will look like later on when somebody, for example, retires? Does this mean that we need to now, for example, change the retirement age, or is there some other program that we may have to envision for when those persons actually do need a pension and there's not as much there?
So one of the things that I have been very clear with my technical officers about this whole program, this whole initiative, is that we need to do a better job ensuring that people are financially literate. Over the course of the last 18 months while sitting in this seat, I've had stories from people who have discovered, after having believed they made contributions to their private pensions, only learn that the money wasn't there because their employers hadn't contributed the money. And responsibility certainly rests with the employer for not doing what they were supposed to do. But I also say that there's a small amount of personal responsibility that needs to be accepted. People should be looking at their pension statements every quarter, because every administrator is actually required to provide you with a statement. Look at your statement, check to ensure that your contributions are actually being deposited to your account, check the performance of your pension, the investment performance, and if you need help, then reach out for some help. I've asked the team to prepare some materials around financial literacy, and we're going to be working with the fund administrators to affect that program where we have more informed people around matters of finance, especially personal finance. I get the sense, well, for me, it's fairly easy because I have a couple of degrees in finance. Most people tend to get scared when dealing with banks or other financial institutions, and they get scared when dealing with big things like mortgages or pensions. And my own view is your mortgage is probably the single largest debt obligation you're going to take on in your life. And so rather than being afraid of it, you need to kind of embrace it and understand it, because when you understand it, the opportunities for you to be taken advantage of are substantially reduced. So I have a big thing about financial literacy, and I'm looking to work with fund administrators, but also the CFA Society of Bermuda, who do a bunch of work around educating people around the things about finance. It can be daunting because some people are afraid of numbers. Some people are afraid of dealing with complex things around money. But the way that you can better understand this stuff is to learn about it and not to be afraid to ask who's talking to you about these subjects that you don't understand. It's not that difficult. Finance is just like learning the alphabet. It's a language. And the more you practice it, the better you become at using it.
So, Minister, having said that, recognizing that, Ryan has asked a question with respect to some of the fears that people may have or the cautiousness that people may have. What is it that your ministry intends to do, particularly, this is one of the immediate measures. And I first would like to say that we'd like to commend your ministry for the expediency in which you've acted during this crisis. Having said that, I know that there will come a time where everybody's looking back to say, well, is this the right thing? But can you tell us, was this legislation unanimously passed throughout the House of Assembly? Is this something that both parties supported?
It was unanimously passed on Friday. I think there was a fairly substantial debate. So on Friday, we did our first full virtual meeting of the House of Assembly. And I had, I think, three sets of regulations and a piece of legislation. So I was on my feet virtually for 4 hours. And wow. I can recall sending a WhatsApp to one of my colleagues asking, is everybody going to speak on this? And pretty much everybody spoke on it who was in the House on Friday. I think was broad support, but I think colleagues were also concerned about the longer term implications of people's pensions.
Absolutely.
And I think, Ryan, you asked this question earlier and I didn't answer it, so let me answer it now. My recommendation to people is I'm of the view, and I'm a bit of an optimist, that the fallout from this crisis isn't going to last forever. We will get back on our feet. And as I was taught when I was a kid, you make hay when the sun is shining. And so for those persons who decide to avail themselves to this option, when you're back on your feet, contribute an extra 1 or 2% to your pension. What the idea here is for you to save for a rainy day or for your retirement. And we never know when crisis is going to hit us at some point in our life. The existing framework that we have in place now has a number of hardship withdrawals that people can make to fund an education, to fund rent if you lose your job, to fund mortgage, to fund medical expenses. And so as time has gone on, and legislation is about 20 years old in Bermuda, much, much older in more developed countries like the United States and in Europe. But try to save the money. And in as much as you do need to access it at times of hardship, it is a resource for you to make available to yourself. Now, I would suggest that it should probably be the last one, but in desperate times, people need to kind of figure out what options they have, and this is one of them.
Okay. I like the way that you were able to sort of convey a very practical measures that people could take right now. And then I also like the fact that you mentioned that this fallout won't last forever. And I know that we're going to shift over to sort of the economic recovery plan in a minute. But before that, I mean, government has paid out 7,000 applicants this week in unemployment benefits, $22 million in total. How long? So it's clear that we're still bleeding to some extent. You've mentioned the economic fallout and that it won't last forever. How long, in your estimation, I know this probably is tough for you to answer, but how long do you think before we get over this speed bump where we're not bleeding anymore and we're actually on that path towards recovery?
Well, I can speak for Bermuda, but we have to remember that Bermuda is a part of the global economy. We last week opened Bermuda up partially, and I think over the coming weeks we'll open Bermuda up a bit more. We've been very fortunate, I think, in terms of the fairly small numbers relative to other places, and that we haven't had community spread. And I think the decision that the government has taken to effectively close the country down while we try to contain this virus on Bermuda was a great decision. So we'll start opening the country up again, and that will get us back on our feet to some degree. But there are parts of our economy that are very reliant on external forces. For instance, our tourism industry requires people to be able to fly in and out of Bermuda. Once the airlines come back to the island, the question becomes, will people want to come here? And our question of those people is, do we want those people here? And the answer to that is yes, if they're free of COVID-19. And so I think we need to do a bit of work around figuring out how that's all going to work. I read something yesterday that indicated that California is probably not going to open up fully until July. Now, why California? Do I mention it? California is probably the second largest economy in the United States, wow, next to New York. That's fairly significant. And I have to have folks understand that our economy, while we have our own industry here through international business being the largest piece of it, is very much impacted by what happens west of us and east of us. So if the United States is not fully operational and kind of in a recession, that would dampen the level of economic activity that exists in Bermuda. So that's a long way of saying I don't know, and I'm not embarrassed to say I don't know, because I'd rather you hear me tell you what I think.
No, absolutely, yeah.
To me telling you something that sounds great but is actually pretty made up.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other part of my question, I suppose, referred to sort of from the Bermuda standpoint as far as the government. So I know, for example, we've raised the debt ceiling. We're going to have to make some adjustments as far as our budget. At what point in that area, when it comes to your ministry and sort of the yearly budget, At what point would you say, and maybe the answer for that one is you don't know too, because of course that's impacted by the external factors which you've just mentioned, but can you give any indication? So for example, if prior to this we were on track to maybe reducing our debt and having a sense of stability in the next 5 years, how far have we, for example, been pushed back now as a result? And what sort of factors would determine how much further that goes along?
Well, I can answer that best by saying that before I got on camera with you guys, I was in a meeting with the Premier and the unions discussing how we can work together to solve this challenge. One of the things, so when we started the fiscal April 1, the government was projecting to spend $20 million more than it raised in revenue. So we had a small deficit, and the deficit was primarily linked to our decision to make investments in technology and capital expenditures. I'm of the view that I have no problem borrowing money to fund long-term investments, and our operating costs need to be covered by our revenue. Well, we have a problem now because with the drop-off in tourism and the closing of the economy, that has resulted in a contraction of our revenue base for 2020, 2021. So in effect, unless we reduce some of our spending, we'll have a substantially greater deficit. And I think I mentioned on Friday in the House of Assembly, that number, based on our preliminary estimates, was going to go from negative 20 million to negative 315 million. That number was unsustainable, and we would have challenges in the debt markets raising that much money. Now, listen, I think we can find people to lend us the money. The question becomes, how much do we want to pay for that money? Yeah. And the Bermuda economy is a very sophisticated thing. It is heavily reliant on investment from people who normally would not live here, actually operate in Bermuda. So it's foreign direct investment. The companies that are based here, as are the banks, are heavily dependent on Bermuda's government's debt rating. Now, our debt rating today is investment grade, the lower level of investment grade. If we suffer a substantial decline in our ratings, it makes the cost of money for those companies more expensive. If the cost of money for those companies is more expensive, they have to charge their customers higher prices in order to generate an appropriate return. If you're operating in a competitive environment and you're charging more than your competitors, you can see how that doesn't work. Yeah. So companies then have to make a decision. Do I stay in the place where my capital is expensive, or do I move to a place where it's cheaper? If they opt to move, they take the jobs with them. Similarly, on the banking front, banks' capital treatment, so when a bank makes a loan, it has to set aside a certain amount of capital for that loan, and that's determined by the regulator. If the bank's cost of capital is high, they charge their customers higher rates, and the higher rates effectively mean less money for customers to spend on other things. So it has a dampening effect on an economy. And so I've been talking a lot about the importance of our ratings, the importance of maintaining those ratings, the importance of managing those ratings, because the impacts of a decline in the ratings can be very, very, very dramatic on our economy. Yeah. So that's why we have to find savings in our budget, because the option to just borrow is not one that leads to a favorable outcome.
Now, Minister, on that topic, or just slightly shifting now to the banks specifically, and I know that you're, as you've mentioned, you're a reputable financier prior to coming into politics and being the Minister of Finance, and so you have a wealth of experience and knowledge in that arena. And I'm trying to better understand or get both sides, because you've been on both sides of it. The question was posed or requested rather, that the banks in Bermuda lower their interest rates, and we saw that, for instance, one bank in particular, Butterfield Bank in Bermuda, had lowered their interest rates slightly, but in the Cayman, they had lowered it significantly more. The response to that by Butterfield Bank was, well, there's good reason for that. And the reason is that the government's debt is substantially higher and our growth rate is substantially lower than in the Cayman. What? Because I know that you're going to have a balanced approach here because you've been on both sides of the coin. Can you just provide someone like me who has no experience in it, what type of clarity, some type of clarity on whether or not you understand what the bank's saying there, and what, if anything, can the government do to assist them in assisting us, if you will?
So, Eron, you cut out kind of halfway in the middle of your question, but I think I got the essence of it. I have been engaged in conversations with the banks around the role that they play in this economy. I'm very familiar with kind of the differential and the rate cut that happened here in Bermuda and in Cayman. The banks actually published a piece, made a statement last week about why they did what they did. What I have chosen not to do is get myself involved in a public spat with the banks. What I will do, though, is continue to reinforce with the banks the important role that they play in helping this economy to remain stable and to help it grow. I accept that while today they may not have particular challenges, if this economy goes sideways and there's huge unemployment and huge job losses, that those persons who either have borrowed money from the banks or who have used banking services like credit cards or loan products or mortgage products will be unable to meet their obligations. And so the banks are just as important and equal stakeholder in this economy as anybody else. And they have a role to play. And what I'm planning on doing, we're meeting to figure out how we can work together. I've read their comment around Cayman versus Bermuda. It would be so easy for me to get into kind of a jurisdiction bashing kind of to and fro. I'm not going to do that. I do believe, though, that there's opportunity for us to work together to figure out how we do what's best for Bermuda. Because this is very simple for me. In order for the banks to be successful, Bermuda has to be successful. Because if your customers aren't making money and doing what they're supposed to be doing, then your business isn't going to thrive.
No, exactly. Now, Ryan, and I know you're probably going to jump in here in a second. I don't know if you have a question on this, because I was going to move to the unemployment benefits briefly.
It was on the same topic. Minister, I'm mindful of the fact that you said you didn't want to get in a public dispute. I just want to draw reference to some of the statements that were made by the Premier. He'd indicated, for example, in the past 2 weeks, that international businesses and the banks, for example, he was expecting a bit more from them and that they needed to step up. Now, I'm mindful that perhaps you didn't want to get in a tit-for-tat with any particular bank, but the Premier did warn that if the banks and the international businesses didn't do their part, or what in his view was their fair share, that he would have no choice but to make legislative amendments or take certain actions which would sort of push them in that direction. I can only imagine that as finance minister, some of those legislative amendments as they relate to finance would have to go through you, or at least have your input. And I'm wondering if you have any comments surrounding that. Do you think, for example, that the banks and the international businesses are doing enough? And secondly, if in the Premier's view they aren't, what sort of legislative amendments and changes do you think you would pursue or push to be enacted in order to make sure that the Premier is satisfied and that the public are satisfied that they are doing enough?
Okay. So, Ryan, I philosophically, I don't believe that we can legislate every kind of behavior. We live and work in a free market economy that I think most of the time actually works pretty good. It's not perfect. There are things that we can do to improve it, but I do not believe that the solution to every problem is a piece of legislation. Now, you mentioned the banks, you mentioned international business. The international business community has been contributing in jobs, has been contributing assistance along the course of this crisis. And so I don't have a challenge with them in terms of their support and their assistance. They continue to work with us, and we're looking forward to working with them as we navigate kind of this crisis. The banks, I have said publicly before that they've done something in terms of time, in terms of offering people the ability to defer payments. That has been very helpful from a liquidity perspective for individuals. It allows them to kind of save their cash for when they really need it. Are there more things that they can be doing? Absolutely. But I'm going to be asking them for other considerations. But I also accept, having been a banker for the better part of 25 plus years, that there will come a point in time of this crisis when, because there's usually a delay between an event happening and its full impact. But those persons who have lost their jobs, who will deplete their savings, who will find it difficult to make payments on their credit cards and on their loans and on their mortgages. It may be 2, 3, 4 months down the road for some people. Others may be immediate. But the banks will have to deal with that. And so we are going to be working with them around trying to find a way to move forward together for the best interests of Bermuda, accepting that they also have a responsibility to their shareholders. But if this then it's not going to be good prospects for any business that operates in the jurisdiction. And so we have to be collectively, and I don't want to sound all hairy-fairy here, but we have to be arm in arm working together to navigate our way through this crisis.
Thank you, Minister. And I appreciate that response. Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth. However, I did sort of ask, based off of the Premier's suggestion, for example, that there may be some legislative provisions, what those might be. And your response to me seems to be that, in your view, you don't think that legislation is the way to go with this. So I'm curious, is that the actual case, that you don't think any legislation at all should be used to push these companies in a certain direction?
So in my budget statement in February, I talked about the potential establishment of a conduct authority. Now, I think in light of our fiscal constraints, that may have to get pushed off a little bit. But what the intention behind the conduct authority was to have a regulatory body, hopefully a small one, that assesses the conduct of financial services companies. Because I believe that there's a massive difference in knowledge between those who actually practice banking and financial services and those who actually consume. And when you have disequilibrium like that, the opportunities for people to be taken advantage of are significant, unless you have a regime in place that encourages those persons who provide services to be fair and transparent with those who consume them. While putting in place a conduct authority may not happen this fiscal year, perhaps there's scope for us to do things to affect that kind of behavior. I'm a believer in the concept of kind of engaging in meaningful dialogue and talking with people. And so, what the bank actually has in me as the Minister of Finance is someone who has some experience in what it is. Now, my job is no longer as a banker, I'm a policymaker now. So I kind of know the ins and outs, and I probably have a clue of kind of which areas to kind of focus on in terms of pushing them for their support that are probably the least painful and ones that probably would engender their support.
I just had one more follow-up, Eron, if you don't mind, and that's based off of sort of the last part of your statement, Minister, from my earlier question surrounding whether international businesses and the banks are doing enough. There are certain segments in the community who suggest that they aren't doing enough. You said in your response, for example, that you think that they're contributing, they could do a little bit more, but that their response has been overall pretty good, that they provide a very large number of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. I'm mindful of the fact, for example, that whilst some international businesses have contributed, let's say $100,000 or set up different funds, that we have thousands and tens of thousands of companies that are registered here that perhaps have no involvement at all. And I think Eron and I discussed it in previous shows, for example, that it may be a case where a lot of these companies are sort of riding on the shoulders of a lot of those smaller, not smaller, but a lot of those few companies that are in Bermuda that are making regular contributions and the like. So I'm curious, is it true, or do you really feel that international businesses and companies are doing enough, and that it has been sort of a balanced system thus far?
Eric, sorry, Brian. Again, you started the question. Is it? And then you cut out. So I missed the last piece.
Sure. Keeping in mind the fact that we have a lot of companies here that have no involvement in Bermuda whatsoever, that are simply registered here, for example, and keeping also in mind that although some companies have made contributions, there are a lot who haven't made contributions. Do you think that businesses and the banks and the like, are they doing enough to help support and strike the right balance in this crisis?
So as the Minister of Finance, I'm responsible for the financial services industry. So most of the international business that's here is under my purview, my remit. I will tell you that I constant requests from international business on how can we help more. And I think part of our challenge has been we've been fighting fires for the last 6 weeks, that the energy has been focused on managing the spread of this disease. When I announce my Economic Advisory Committee next week, international business will be heavily represented on the advisory committee for a couple of reasons. One, they have the manpower to kind of do the work that's required to kind of assist us in working through this. Two, they have some great ideas. Three, they really want to be involved, because these companies are here because they choose to be here. They could be in other places, but we offer them a set of unique characteristics that make this jurisdiction ideal as opposed to others. So I'm looking forward to working with IB. I think they are willing to help and will help. You mentioned something about smaller ones kind of riding on the coattails, my phrasing, of others. I just want to kind of just make a slight correction there. The Premier and I have traveled a couple of times to Europe to kind of promote Bermuda to the European Union. And one of the things that we face, constant challenges we face, is that Bermuda is somehow a tax haven, and we are allowing certain kinds of behavior to happen on our shores, which couldn't be further from the truth. And then there was a concern about mailbox companies that have no physical presence. You all will have heard about the Bermuda experience last January of being blacklisted by the European Union. And then you would have heard the celebration in May when we came off the blacklist to the gray list. And then again, January of 2020, we were elevated to the white list. What that all means at the end of the day, in fairly simple terms, is that the European Union has assessed what we do here and how we do it, and deemed us to be cooperative from a tax perspective. So the notion that we are somehow a tax haven is a nonsense. Now, all of that, I say that because of this. We have companies here that may not have a physical presence. Those companies have to go, because the economic substance legislation that we have now had stamped by the EU requires companies with certain activities to have physical presences here in Bermuda. What that actually means is they need to hire people to work for those businesses here in Bermuda. They need to have their board meetings here. And so that's a plus for our economy. And so they are contributing as well, maybe not as much as the larger companies, but that's fine. We just want everybody to help.
But on that notion, Minister, and I know that you've got to go relatively soon. We've got another 15 to 17 minutes. We're going to get you off on time because you have much important things to do. There's been a big two words, shared sacrifice, and what that means. And I know Ryan was just talking about IB, for instance, and their responsibility and the role that they play. So we've heard your response in that regard. Personally, when I hear the term shared sacrifice, I look at it and I say, well, when we say shared sacrifice, we're talking about the same people sharing. Orion and I have even talked about, for instance, members of parliament taking pay cuts. But upon reflection, I thought about that and I said, well, we always have that conversation whenever there's a reason to cut back, on our financial resources. And to your credit, and your colleagues' credit, you're doing an outstanding job during this time. You're working more than you ever have before. And so to my mind, it says, well, when we talk about shared sacrifice, we should be looking at the wealthy in our community. We should be looking at the IB companies and those who are making, the millions of dollars per year here in Bermuda. For instance, like some initiatives that I want to get your feedback on is a wealth tax, a corporation tax, and for instance, a higher payroll tax for those making, enormous amounts of money in the country. And I know that's a bit of a loaded question with a lot of response, so I'm not expecting you to answer each one of them, but when we're talking about these ideas, what is your view on taking some of these measures, bearing in mind that they are legislative?
Eron, there must be on this technology, because whenever you guys ask a seemingly tough question, it usually kind of spirals out.
Nothing in your favor today. We have to bring you on for another.
So I'm not one to shrink away from a tough question.
Right.
So I think you're talking about wealth tax and higher income tax on those who earn more.
Yes.
What I'll tell you is this, and Premier and I are kind of very much aligned on this one. We see payroll tax as being an inhibitor to job creation. Right? And that may sound counterintuitive, and it is a little bit, right? Our tax code today is more progressive now than ever before. And those persons who earn the least out of this most recent budget have seen their taxes reduced in favor of those who earn more paying more. So I get and I lived in the States for a long time, and I would have been referred to as a limousine liberal. So someone who likes really nice stuff, but believes in kind of shared sacrifice.
Yeah.
I don't believe that the solution to all of our problems is to tax more. I think part of the solution to our problems is to spend more wisely. We run $1 billion government, and I'm challenged to understand why that isn't enough. Now, the question that I often challenge my colleagues with is in cabinet is, I'm fine spending more on X, but what are we going to spend less on? Because most families earn a fixed amount of money, and they have to cover off on their expenses. And if it isn't enough money at the end of the month, they have to figure out where they're going to trim. Why shouldn't governments do that? And I accept that there are instances when governments need to go beyond to do extraordinary things because of circumstances. But those should be the exception, not the norm. So I don't think we have a tax problem. I think we need to do better work around how do we prioritize what we spend. Governments, the way they tend to work, and this is kind of a really simple example, is so you had one party in power forever, and then there was a change, and then another change, and then another change. Well, each party puts in place their own series of favorite programs.
Yeah.
The new guy comes in, hates the old guy's programs, but layers on their own, and never gets rid of the old stuff, and never assesses things for like, does this still work? Is this still relevant? And I challenged my team here in the Ministry of Finance around how we're structured as an organization. I think the structure that we have here today is probably 25 to 30 years old. The threats that we face today as a ministry are very different than the ones we faced 30 years ago. So there should be scope for reorganizing the organization to ensure that we can meet the needs today and in the future, not for the past. And I think governments need to do the same thing as households do. I mean, in my household, there are 5 of us, and I'm responsible for, bringing home the money. And my wife is responsible for running our family. So she's the CEO and I'm the chairman. But we have to make choices, and we decided to education for our children. And that may mean that every time there's a break in school, that my children aren't getting on an airplane to go to some obscure part of the world for a cultural experience. And most families do that. And I think that we as a government need to kind of look at doing the same thing in terms of managing how we spend, because, we raised, this year was supposed to be about $1 billion in revenue.
Now, Minister, you've indicated that you don't think we have a tax problem, that we have a spending problem. But I'm mindful of at the start of this conversation when you referred to sort of some of the new debt that Bermuda has to take on and our ratings. That if our ratings are dropped or reduced, that this becomes a threat for international businesses. Yes, and so it's in our best interest to maintain our ratings.
Yep.
But we can only borrow to a certain extent. So with that in mind, I mean, Eron has mentioned a wealth tax, and I think oftentimes we look at that as sort of punishing people for being wealthy or implying that they're not paying their fair share. But keeping in mind what you've stated, that if we need to borrow more money and we're unable to, or if our rating gets lower, then international businesses suffer. I mean, international businesses, some of them have expressed a willingness to pay more. We've had CEOs in the past who have come right out and stated we'd be okay with paying a very small amount of tax, for example, if it means that Bermuda stays afloat. So keeping that in mind, has any consideration been given at all to sitting down with these companies and saying, you know, look, we're not coming for you because you have money and because we think you should be paying more or because you owe us something, but you know, we're coming to you because if you don't pay more, or if we don't get more money in this economy from people who have it, then we may very well be forced to get that money elsewhere, which will then have the knockoff effect of lowering our ratings. So has any consideration been given to approaching them from that perspective as opposed to one of, you know, targeting the rich?
I listen. I think one of the comments that I've made repeatedly, and I got challenged on it briefly last evening, was how far will we go? And what I've said is, in working to get this, we need to consider all options, and nothing is off the table. I think the conversation around tax is a legitimate one, and one that needs to be had. You will appreciate that in my job, anytime I say anything, it is viewed as a signal for potential future action. And I've had to learn that the hard way. I think that we should look at everything because I think if for no other reason, we can ascertain as to whether something is not a good idea. When I first came back to Bermuda back in 2006 and was working at Butterfield, and someone said to me, "This ain't New York, you know." And that was their nice way of telling me, don't come up in here thinking that you can change everything. Now, people will tell you who work for me and who work with me, and I always ask the question, why are we doing this that way? I'll tell you this. The abacus still works.
Yeah.
We now have electronic ones. They're called smartphones, right? So maybe change will lead to a more efficient way of doing something that's more accurate, more timely, more accessible. And so I think we should have a conversation about tax broadly speaking, because our tax system, in some respects, has helped to create some problems for us. We have a system that funds the government, the proper operation of the government, for the most part, that works. Yet we get accused of being, because we're a zero income tax jurisdiction, of being a tax haven. So there might be some scope to say, how can we change that perception? We need to have that conversation. And yeah. I'm looking forward over the course of the coming months to having that conversation, because I want to be very careful, because I think, unfortunately, sometimes in the field of politics, if a Labor politician says something about tax, it's quickly viewed as, here they are going to grab my money. I will tell you that I've had the good fortune of having parents who invested heavily in my education, and I had my own motivation and drive, and I've had some really good people along the way who've helped me in my professional life, and I've had some degree of success. And that has helped me to be in a position where I can provide for my family. But everyone hasn't had the same opportunities that I've had. And so what I want to do in this job is trying to look for ways of trying to be helpful for people, but also understanding that sometimes the best way to help is to not slice the pie into smaller pieces, but to grow the pie. And I think when with respect to tax, if we can get more people working here, doing more business here, the tax pool grows. That's one way of doing it. Others would say, let's just layer on more taxes. I think we should try to figure out how, as opposed to slicing it into smaller pieces.
That's fair enough. And I mean, I'm mindful of the time. And so we're going to turn over to Eron and then maybe take some questions from the public before you close out. But I mean, my overall concern in asking these questions, Minister, and I say this with the utmost respect, is as follows. We've heard the Premier in the past 2 weeks come on and say, everything is on the table, nothing is off the table. These are desperate, extreme times. We may need to take extreme measures. We've heard him reflect sentiments that perhaps there are others who could be doing more. We've heard that legislation isn't off the table, for example, and other things aren't off the table, and there's a wide range of things that we're considering doing. But as I've asked you today, Minister, about certain things that may happen, you've indicated, for example, you're not in favor of any drastic legislative amendments. You think that the tax structure overall is satisfactory to a large extent. You think that international businesses perhaps could be doing a little bit more, but overall we don't want to perhaps ruffle their feathers or change anything drastically there. But we do need to sort of control our spending and be wiser when it comes to how we manage this government. So my concern, Minister, is that we're talking about taking drastic steps and taking extreme measures and that nothing is off the table. But when it comes down to it, it genuinely seems as though this government and its considerations when it comes to statements like everything is on the table really is a reflection of when we're referring to things being on the table, we're talking about how we're going to cut internally as a country when it comes to spending, as opposed to genuinely putting everything on the table and considering measures which we hadn't considered before. So I'm asking you, I mean, what's really new and what are some of these drastic measures? Because based off of what I'm hearing from you, it doesn't seem that drastic to me, and that's from a personal perspective. And I know that was
let me address
to Eron, but I just wanted to share that concern.
Well, let me respond to your concern, Ryan. The tax situation with respect to international business is something that has been legislated into law. And if we were going to make a radical change in that, we would be basically taking the sovereign word and crumpling it up and saying it isn't worth anything.
That's the 2037 policy, yes?
That's right. Right. We've entered into agreements, and people have made a series of economic decisions around those agreements. And I would say that we are duty bound to honor them. So maybe everything on the table is a turn of a phrase, but I would say this. When I took action with respect to Morgan's Point and going out and borrowing a bunch of money to deal with the borrowers, the lenders, I'm sorry, who had not been paid back their money, the rating agencies came out and applauded us for the sovereign honoring its obligations. Everything's on the table, except those things that are not on the table. And we have to be very careful about the agreements that we enter into as a government, and it's not just the PLP government, but the government, the entity government, and honor those obligations. Because I tell you this, if we lose our credibility as a jurisdiction, we're in real trouble. Yeah. And so we have to be mindful of when we take dramatic actions, and people will say that I have the reputation of being very deliberative and very moderate. I tend to think things through because as a person my age, you understand that for every action, there's a reaction. And my deliberations are typically trying to understand what impact my decisions are going to have on other things. And I think as a leader, you would want me to be thoughtful about anything that I do, because giving a baby a piece of candy soothes them for a hot second, but it doesn't address the problem if the problem isn't that they want a piece of candy.
Sure. So Minister, I like that quote. I'm going to have to steal that one. Everything's on the table. And I know you got to go in 3 minutes, so we'll wrap up. And Minister, we'd like to really take this time to thank you. You're the first minister on behalf of this government, the member of cabinet who's been on the show. We hope to have you back at some time, because 30, 40 minutes is not enough. You come with a wealth of experience, and we've got some live comments, people thanking you for your thought-out responses. But on the notion of what's on the table and what's not on the table, particularly we're asking this, or I'm asking it, of all of our guests on the show, so far is with respect to the recreational cannabis industry and how that could assist Bermuda moving forward or bouncing back. What do you, as finance minister, I know we've talked a lot about cuts, we've talked a lot about how we can save money, but what about something that's going to influx some money into the economy? How do you feel, particularly when we're considering a boost in our tourism numbers coming forward as the finance minister? Not philosophically how you feel about cannabis per se, but from a finance point of view, as you say, how do you feel about that?
I think that ties into a question by Sean as well, Eron, which was, has government considered increasing revenue other than taxes? So I like that you asked specifically about cannabis.
So what I can say, and this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but it's my answer. The discussion on cannabis is something that is actively under consideration with the cabinet. And as you would know, cabinet discussions are secret, so I can't talk about it.
No, sure, fair enough, Minister. Well, I think that there's a number, you mentioned, for example, the Morgan's Point thing. We haven't had an opportunity to discuss it today. We hope to have the opportunity. I think it would do you an injustice if we even asked one question on it now, because you've got to go, so we won't do it now. But I think, Ryan, unless you've got anything further or any questions from the audience, I think we can let the minister go. He's got, that 3:15. But Minister, again, I'm done. We thank you for your time. We appreciate it. On behalf of the audience, thank you, and we hope to have you back.
Yeah, I did want to ask one question that came in from the public. And Minister, I mean, I think Eron will agree with my sentiments when I say that we really would like to have you back on this show, because we feel like we haven't been able to pick your brain enough. But maybe you've been saved today a little bit, but we definitely appreciate your responses thus far. Gilbert Darrell had asked, can the minister help outline what Bermuda can do to be more attractive to new companies moving to Bermuda and adding to our economy?
I think we are increasingly in a global economy, and the differentiator sometimes are the small things. I think, I often talk about kind of coming through the airport, and the first thing that you want to see when you come to the airport is that someone smiling saying, "Welcome to Bermuda." It's a very small thing, but has a significantly disproportionate impact. I think we need to be welcoming to those who want to invest in our island and who want to help us to create jobs, and understand that they are not our enemy, but sometimes they want to be here for commercial purposes, but also, help promote the economic growth of Bermuda, and that means jobs for Bermudians. I think we'd be open to new people, new ideas, and new money. I'll say this, guys, as the person who is kind of sometimes referred to as the camera-shy minister, I've actually enjoyed this conversation, and I will commit here today that I'll be back on your show.
Well, we appreciate that, Minister. We appreciate that. And that was going to be my closing question to you. So you beat me to it. I know it's 3:15. We undertook to have you off. So again, Minister, on behalf of Ryan and I, and behalf of our listening audience, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank you. And we look forward to having you back. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you. Ryan, that was a really, really interesting discussion. That 54 minutes has gone by relatively fast.
It was actually, it was an enjoyable discussion, I would say. You have certain topics and guests where, it's a bit awkward, where it's a bit different and you don't know what's coming. But that was genuinely, I felt like I was having an actual conversation in the office with the minister. And I'm sure the public, we've seen some of the comments already. People enjoyed those questions that we asked. They enjoyed the minister's outright responses. They were very well thought out, very composed, and we can appreciate what he said. He didn't beat around the bush. He gave due diligence as where he could, and said, "Look, I can't speak to this," but it was quite enjoyable, and we're looking forward to having the Honorable Curtis Dickinson back on this show.
Actually, I think we're doing a relatively okay job, for guests to undertake on the show. Usually that's the hardest part of it. But again, thanks to the Minister of Finance, the Honorable Curtis Dickinson, for coming on board, sharing his wealth of knowledge and how this government intends to recover. And obviously he's got a tough task, Ryan, and I thought he spoke very candidly. And he provided a great deal of insight. For example, during the course of asking questions in a press conference, there's only so much of a response that one can give. So when the premier, for instance, says certain things, it's interesting to now get the insight from the finance minister to say, hey, look, yes, everything's on the table except for what's not. But let's say, well, even if this was on the table, these are the risks. These are the risks, right? Yeah. So it allows us to have a more fruitful and edifying, conversation. Because I just think fundamentally and philosophically, there are some reasons, for example, why I want to see a wealth tax or a corporation tax. But again, it's nice to know, practically speaking, why some of these things at this point in time, in the view of others, are not feasible, because it helps us to have a more educated conversation. So thanks again to the Minister of Finance.
And it's a balance to be struck, right? Because you want to ask critical questions without scaring people away, right? So, I mean, I was surprised even that some people were willing to come on the show and discuss with us and allow us to pick their brain. And they've done so openly, right? And we tell them at the beginning of the show, hey, look, we may have some general topics we want to cover, but ultimately, this conversation is driven by your responses. It's driven by the commenters, and you have to be flexible for that, right? We don't come on here with a script. So I definitely appreciated that. Now, Eron, there were some questions that were asked surrounding business, and I know we didn't get to ask them, but I think that the commenters and the public will be quite happy to know who our next guest is. Are you ready to transition over to that?
No, absolutely. And I think it's actually, we've been blessed to have an interesting combination of guests, right? Because last week we had Dr. Brathwaite, and then we was followed by the nurses. We've had the Minister of Finance today, and followed by one of, or the individual leading what has been a department, or rather a Quango rather, that is the government have committed $12 million to, and have essentially said, well, look, this is one of the immediate measures we're prepared to take to invest in or reinvigorate our economy. And our next guest is none other than Miss Erica Smith, who's currently the Executive Director of BEDC, the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation. And without further ado, we'll bring Miss Smith on live. And so here she is. Miss Smith, how are you?
I'm good. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm great. Great to be on the show, guys.
Great to have you. Great to have you. Can you just start off before we get into some of the questions we have for you, and tell us a bit more about the BEDC and how you guys have been affected specifically by COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, so BEDC is basically the government's and the country's premier free resource for business advice and support to our local small and medium-sized businesses. We provide a range of services from financial products to help businesses from startup phase right through to growth phase, and in some cases, even exit phase. We have a pretty robust entrepreneurship education regime, because we fundamentally believe that entrepreneurs need to understand best practice in order to create great businesses and enterprises. We provide an opportunity or a program around networking, collaboration, and helping entrepreneurs to get to know each other. We facilitate international partnerships. We also facilitate micro enterprise. And so, we provide everything from vending licenses right up to guarantees. Now, how have we been impacted by COVID-19? Well, I think everyone has been impacted. And so, we immediately took steps to try and readjust our 19-20 budget to be able to provide some resources to entrepreneurs. And then we went on a roadshow with regard to advocacy and lobbying and speaking with our government partners to say what types of resources we could actually put towards entrepreneurship and businesses to help them to stay afloat. Our office is all working remotely. We still haven't reopened up our physical location as yet, but we are, everyone is up with regard to remote working. And so we're accepting applications remotely. We're providing advice and support to businesses remotely, and we're approving applications. We've also been impacted with regard to, having to put a hold on some of the projects and initiatives that we were progressing in order to focus really our attention on providing triage for businesses. What could we do to try and help businesses stay as much afloat as possible, try to help as many businesses as possible as we try to figure out what will happen in a post-COVID-19 world?
Now, Ms. Smith, you've taken over from the BEDC from 2014. The BEDC, the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, is a rather new organization. I know we had the Small Business Development Corporation in the past, but you've been there since 2014, and we've seen a lot of work from the BEDC in recent years. The profile when it comes to entrepreneurship and small business has been raised significantly, I would say, in the past 5 years. Would you say that your organization was adequately prepared, at least? I know that's probably impossible for any group, but what steps do you think that you took as director in the past that perhaps positions you to be able to do triage when it comes to small businesses that are currently suffering?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I think first and foremost, in the last 5 years, we've really tried to evolve the organization to have it be more responsive, have it be more reflective of what entrepreneurship should look like, and really to raise the profile that entrepreneurship is actually a viable career choice, right? And to build that ecosystem within Bermuda. Not that I'm saying that wasn't happening before, but I think the profile of an entrepreneur and a business owner from a local perspective really wasn't celebrated as much as it has been in the last 5 years. And so for us, I think the steps of really having a pretty robust outreach platform with regard to tapping into entrepreneurs. We have a pretty extensive social media presence. We have a radio show that we facilitate ourselves in order to talk about entrepreneurship. And so really being able to reach out immediately as we saw the world kind of turning to this kind of pandemic to say, what could we do? How can we do it quickly? And how can we shift and pivot? And I think for ourselves, we also embrace kind of this entrepreneurial mindset. And so even though we may have processes and procedures and projects that were happening pre-COVID-19, I think the ability to be able to pivot pretty quickly to say, you know what, we were doing that, but we're going to stop that because we need to focus on this is a testament to the flexibility of our organization. And I'm pretty proud of that.
Yeah, Ms. Smith, you've recently made some comments that were particularly interesting to me, and that was to throw away the rule book and get rid of the red tape. Can you please just expand on that a bit further and let people know exactly what you mean with a bit more detail? Where are our bureaucratic policies, if you will, getting in the way of progressive change?
Well, I mean, I think everybody anyone who has a business or anyone who has tried to start a business in Bermuda has experienced some form of delay in some way, shape, or form. And Bermuda has a very great international reputation. It obviously has a standard with regard to fiscal prudence and financial responsibility. And obviously it has legislation and regulations in place in order to maintain that standard and that reputation. That is fantastic. But we are a heavily regulated environment, and that regulation has a bit of an anti-entrepreneurial spirit, right? In other countries, you could literally start up a business in a day, 2 days. The ability to do that in Bermuda is compromised by the fact that we don't have a closed system with regard to a one-stop shop for registering of a business, and then facilitating the creation of a bank account, facilitating, your taxes, your social insurance. Now, BEDC, we have been working on this because we know that this is an issue, and we're committed to getting that up and running. But even on our side, I feel frustrated sometimes because I feel like the rate of progress that I would like for things to go are not progressing the way we are. So I think we have a lot of growth within Bermuda with regard to embracing a real streamlined process for starting up a business, for growing a business, and for exiting a business. I think, I was just talking to some entrepreneurs yesterday, And, they shared their story that it took them a year to get a business bank account. This is an established business that has two businesses operating for well over 10 years. And just the hoops and the jumps and the red tape. And, I'm not picking on our banking partners. I think that, we have put in standards and systems that we need to maintain in order to keep our credit rating with regard to the island and our reputation, but we still need to figure out a way to embrace a streamlined system to bring these things on par. Other things, right? Payment processing, the fact that, in every other country or most other countries, you have the ability to facilitate transactions between, businesses and consumers, sometimes even without the banks involved. And, in a country as sophisticated as Bermuda, we still have not been able to achieve that to date. It frustrates me. Even more, it frustrates entrepreneurs, which then frustrates me. So, what can we do to facilitate that? And so when I say throw away the rule book, I honestly believe, and, people can disagree with me, but I honestly believe that the way how we conduct business, the way businesses look in a post-COVID-19 world, not just in Bermuda, but in the world, will be different. It will be different because we would have experienced coronavirus and a pandemic. And so we will still have some residual impacts with regard to how consumers interact with businesses, how people and family and friends interact with each other. And we just don't know where this virus is going to turn or how it's going to evolve. And so I think we're going to have to utilize technology a bit more. We're going to have to embrace more efficient ways of doing business in order to prepare ourselves to be able to be profitable and sound businesses in this post-COVID-19 world.
Absolutely. I mean, Ms. Smith, I actually think that most people would agree with you. I mean, Eron and I were speaking just yesterday, and even yesterday I made a Facebook post because I was trying to, for example, accept online payment on a certain platform. And to do that, you have to get a merchant account. You have to go through a local payment processor. But in order to do that, you need a business account. But in order to do that, you need a tax letter. And in order to do that, so the hoops and hurdles, I mean, I don't think that you're saying anything particularly new in that sense, because everybody, it seems, has been having this problem for a very long time. And so it seems like we've identified the problem, and organizations such as yourself, I mean, your organization is limited, right? Because you can come up with every product, solution, and service under this sun. But if it's impossible for me to go and get a tax letter and register my business or get a bank account, then all of your work is for naught. So when it comes to throwing away the rule book, I just want to hone down in a little bit more on that. What role does the BEDC play in that? And if you're throwing away, if you're suggesting, for example, I mean, I take it that when you say throw away the rule book, you're referring to some of the other industries and other organizations and their processes, which slow things down. But what role do you play as an advocate? And have you considered, for example, throwing away the rule book yourself? I'm sure that as director, you have to perhaps maybe show some deference. Maybe this statement you've already made is something that's considered extreme in some circles. And I have to ask, is there something that you could be doing more at the BEDC? Does throwing away the rule book apply to you as well when it comes to really championing simpler processes for the average vendor, the average entrepreneur on the street?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, BEDC and even myself, we're not exempt, right? I mean, I'm a 52-year-old woman, who has probably practiced and has, habits and behaviors in a certain way. I realize that, in order to evolve and move forward, some of my preferences will have to be put to the side in order to facilitate growth and involvement. And so even within BEDC, we have intense debates. I've been pretty proud that, in the last year, we've diversified our staff and complement. We have now on staff, we have diversity with regard to demographics, diversity with regard to race. diversity with regard to gender, that really, I think, brings to bear the ability to create new and innovative products and services that we've never had before. And I see BEDC as being a work in progress. We've evolved. We're a different organization than we were, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And, a year from now and 5 years from now, we'll be a completely different organization. And in all of that, I'm saying it doesn't even have to stop with me. I don't see myself as being, the head of BEDC forever. I think that there is definitely an opportunity for others to take the lead. We have a pretty robust framework with regard to IDers coming to the table and thinking not even outside the box, just throwing out the box. There is no box. And so, yes, I would agree. Yes, BEDC can evolve. We will evolve. And as part of this COVID-19 response, we are evolving, right? So we're moving more on to online submissions of applications, being able to then validate them without having to have some manual process in place or a person touching that. And then eventually we're moving towards a streamlined system of when you register with BEDC, you're registered with tax commissioner and you're registered with social insurance. And we've been having those discussions. COVID-19 just means that we have to accelerate that faster.
Well, Miss Smith, you mentioned your age. We certainly would have never asked that. We would never.
I thought the same thing. Really? I mean,
we would never have assumed that somebody who is saying let's throw out the rule book would be the age that you said that you were, because that's generally coming from the younger generation. People saying, well, look, we've got these revolutionary ideas. The way that let's do out with the old, in with the new. So Ms. Smith, is actually refreshing to hear that, knowing that somebody who's leading such an important corporation as the one that you are has these views. Now, on that topic, I just wanted to ask you with respect to what is the process of succession there at the BEDC. So, for example, young people who wanted to get involved, not just as entrepreneurs, but who wanted to get involved with helping other entrepreneurs, or, you may have successful young business people who say, look, I want to take part in the BEDC. How do you get involved, not as an applicant for a grant, or if you will, but someone to know what exactly do you do? For example, how can I get involved and say, well, look, I want to take part in progressing, Bermuda's young people and Bermuda's entrepreneurs?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So it just takes an email and an outreach to just say, we want to be involved, or we have an idea, or could we get together and have some type of think tank? We're always looking for knowledgeable people, expert people who have different thought processes. As a result of COVID-19, we're moving a lot of our seminars and multi-week courses into an e-commerce online format. We're having chat and choose with regard to ability for entrepreneurs to access, knowledgeable people, connection. So we're open. Just email us.
No, absolutely. Can you say your email out, because we'll probably to put it on the bottom of the screen.
Sure. So info@bedc.bm. Please email. And if you want to email myself directly, it's esmith@bedc.bm.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. That's been helpful.
And then also, if I just want to ask, if entrepreneurs or people, they have their own initiatives, programs, events that they would like BEDC to partner with, we're also, we're very open to that. We're a very partnering organization. I'm a firm believer that we can't do it ourselves, and we shouldn't do it all ourselves. And so we've really tapped into a lot of different organizations to bring a wealth of experiences to people, because we only have 14 people. So conceivably, we just cannot do it all. But if we can create this entrepreneurial network and this ecosystem that people can tap into at any point, depending on where they are, depending on what they need, whether it be mentorship, whether that be access to financing, whether that be someone to just be able to look at their business idea and to provide some type of support, advice, validation, whether that's to clear hurdles. We do a lot of that. I must admit, and even through this COVID-19, right, is to be able to advocate and lobby on behalf of businesses to be able to get them what they need in order to move forward.
Absolutely. I mean, that's so refreshing to hear. And I mean, Eron, I'm reflecting back on the conversation we had on Tuesday with the nurses for International Nurses Day, because this is very much a breath of fresh air conversation to hear that the BEDC is such a flexible and adaptable organization. Ms. Smith, I'm sure you're aware that in Bermuda today, a lot of government agencies and Klingos and departments, they sort of get a bad reputation. But it seems as though the BEDC is very responsive, very proactive, and is eager not only to get younger people involved, but to also, I mean, even persons such as yourself with suggestions of throwing out the rule book and changing things. And it seems to be very flexible and open-minded. How do we extend that to the wider community? How do we spread that mindset? What do you think is so special about the BEDC that allows it to be such a responsive, effective organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I don't want to I want to be diplomatic and politically correct. So I'm not.
The other department.
So what I think first and foremost. So I believe as leaders, we have to have the ability to have an agenda for action, right? I think that it is important to do as much research and due diligence and have standards as possible, but you can really become bogged down by analysis paralysis, right? You can have the world's best research on some program that you want to implement, but if you never implement it, then that research just goes out the door. So first and foremost, have an agenda for action, right? We know we will be instituting this. We have language, employ language and actions and movements that are action oriented. So that's one. I'm a firm believer of piloting. Right? We have a laboratory in BDC that is one around piloting initiatives, right? We don't know if it will work unless we ever test it. So test it, see what happens, and then pivot. If it worked or if it needs to be improved, then pivot it for improvement. If it didn't work, then let's throw it out and let's bring something back in. And so I'm a firm believer of testing and piloting new concepts, new versions, and initiatives over and over again. And then third, I think that's really, really important is to embody this entrepreneurial mindset, right? Because even though we as policymakers may not actually be entrepreneurs ourselves, we can learn from the entrepreneurial mindset on what it takes to actually develop great policies, great programs, as if we are creating a business ourselves that could be successful and provide products and services to people. The other thing is just like the vast majority of people that work in BEDC are entrepreneurs themselves. So, I think it's important to hire people that actually understand and walk the walk and talk the talk, because they themselves can then tell us and also work on the stuff that needs to be fixed in order to really grow this ecosystem.
Absolutely. It certainly seems as though you take on the entrepreneurial mindset when it comes to the BEDC itself. So that's a perfect example. And now I'm thinking of Ciara Burrows from Show One, Eron, leading by example. That's great to hear. I do want to take.
Can I just put one more thing on there? I just also, and this is my last, I just thought about this. It is about being comfortable with taking a risk, right? But it's a calculated risk, right? So, I feel like to be a great entrepreneur, you have to walk around with a little bit of discomfort in the belly of your stomach. To be a great policymaker, you have to also walk around with a little bit of discomfort in your belly, because you always need to be on edge, right? You just cannot be complacent, because I think complacency allows then there to be a lack of innovativeness and creativeness. So to be comfortable with risk taking, be knowledgeable, do your research, be prepared, anticipate what could actually be a challenge in the future, but take some risks.
I think that's a good lesson for any entrepreneur, but not just entrepreneurs, anybody in general, especially as we navigate this crisis. I'm seeing a bit of discussion here in the live comments. Anna Pereira asked, what's happening with the BEDC initiative with the co-ops?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we were progressing this right up into COVID-19. We have put out an RFP for creating legislation. So we have received those bids, and we are just now we put it on hold to focus our attention on deploying this COVID-19 $12 million aid to businesses. But we know we need to shift back into kind of progressing some of these projects. So that's one. And then the other thing, we had a co-op pitch competition just before COVID-19 came on board. And so our intent is to pick that up. We believe that cooperatives will play a great part within this new COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 world. I think with the knowledge that some businesses will have to work together in order to survive, in order to reduce the overhead, in order to share cost and resources, that the cooperative development regime and business model is one that should actually be taken up. And so we're more than prepared to be able to progress that. Of course, for ourselves, we just had to take a little bit of a break to focus on what the priority was just to help businesses to be in triage mode, but also to determine what the impact may be on our budget going forward, and then how to deploy the resources we have based on a different budget than what we anticipated before COVID-19.
Absolutely. Lastly, Adrian Lodge asked, because I'm mindful, earlier you said that your team are working online and you're helping businesses to pivot. Adrian Lodge asked, well, he suggested rather, we should do a virtual startup weekend in Bermuda. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. Adrian, please take the mantle, run with it, and of course, BEDC will support you in that. Of course, absolutely. I think we need to be facilitating as many events and initiatives that help to foster entrepreneurship, innovative creativeness. And I think if we can lobby to get prize money and support money for that, then that's what we need to do.
Well, Ms. Smith, we appreciate the fact that you are eager, and you're passionate. That much is very clear. Your responses are extremely candid. I know Adrian's certainly going to be pleased to hear that. Somebody gets when you get a live comment like that as well. We'll consider it. But you've definitely welcomed the suggestions with open arms. We appreciate you coming on board today, and thank you again. Hopefully we can have you back, in maybe, a month or two time to see how you guys have been making out, for example, with that $12 million grant in assisting businesses. How have those businesses, been getting on with it? Are we seeing some of the red tape being put to the side? Because I think the purpose of these discussions is not just so that we have an opportunity to speak, but also that we can get the dialogue out there in the community and see change, exactly, to agitate, if you will, some change within the community to start the discussion. So thank you. Again, I know that it's not easy, and I know we said there's no boxes, but being in a corporation like that, many people feel, well, I've got to fit within the confines, let me stay in my lane, so to speak. So to make such a bold statement that we've got to do away with the rule book and put aside the red tape shows, again, your passion that you have for entrepreneurs in Bermuda. So on behalf of us all, we'd like to thank you. Thank you for your contribution here today. Ryan, if you've got something to say to me.
I just have to share your sentiments, Eron. It was very refreshing to hear some of the suggestions you've made, and we look forward. It's a pleasure. I mean, really, it's an honor, and we're grateful to have somebody like you who's up there driving change from the top. So do you have any last words that you have for perhaps entrepreneurs or the general public out there?
Yeah, I want to say thank you guys for allowing me to be on your platform. I think it's a very important one. I want to just let our island small and medium-sized businesses understand that we understand the predicament that you find yourselves in right now with regard to COVID-19. BEDC is here to support you and to help you in many different ways. And please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Our contact number is 292-5570. Our email is info@bedc.bm, and our website is www.bedc.bm. No requests, no email, no comment is too small. And really, we are just right now trying to save as many businesses as possible that makes sense. And how can we help you to survive this? So please reach out.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Smith. It's been a pleasure to have you. We appreciate the candid conversation, and I'm sure the general public have as well. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Ryan, I think we've had an excellent day.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, with these guests that we've been having, the conversation is just flowed, you know. We haven't had any moments where we've run out of questions or where the general public are lost or confused. We've had some excellent guests and a full show. So, I mean, we're already getting up for the 1.5 hour mark. But I mean, I appreciate Ms. Smith coming on and talking about throwing out the rule book. It's always refreshing to see somebody like that in a position of leadership who is not sticking to the norms, not maintaining the same old, but is really looking for ways to pivot, adapt, and encourage others to do as well. What do you say?
No, absolutely. Again, our guests, this show wouldn't be as good as it has been so far if it wasn't for our guests, you know, and they've been eager to come on. They've been receptive to the questions. Everything has been on the table, you know, except for that, which is not, you know, in the words of our finance minister. I thought that was an excellent phrase, but even throughout his conversation, for example, he was candid, he was frank, and he was thorough. It wasn't just a yes or no response. It wasn't no, this isn't possible, or yes, this is being done, or I've said it before. He was extremely thorough in his responses. I thought he was extremely candid, and we look forward to having him on, you know, on board. I think that one of the purposes, and I'm sure that you'll agree in having this again, is that dialogue to see how things are going to evolve. You know, if we have, for example, you know, the interim CEO Glenn Jones on after our airport opens and our tourism season is starting to recover. It'll be an interesting transition from having him on in the middle of the pandemic, if you will. And the same for the finance minister and Ms. Smith. You know, they've all got enormous tasks where we thank them for taking their time off.
For sure. I mean, people have there's a phrase that says knowledge is power, right? But the true phrase is knowledge is power when it is applied. So I like the fact that you mentioned that we need to have some of these conversations a second time to follow up, because it's one thing for us to sit here and put out all these ideas and have these guests on sharing their insights. But if that action isn't being applied, if it's not being followed up on, the same way that Ms. Smith said, even in her organization, when they pilot programs and things like that, if they've done their research and discussed a certain course of action, then they need to be able to implement it. The second thing I want to say in relation to the discussion, I certainly agree with you as far as the guests that we've had, but I think we also should take some time out to recognize some of our commenters and some of the live discussion. I mean, my friend over here, Canet Island, Empress Burgess, is still going strong with her comments. And I saw Miss Judith Parsons here today commenting as well. So we definitely want to say thank you to some of our repeat listeners and viewers. We've been getting, I think, 10,000 views consistently, Eron. And I think that's an important statement to make too. You know, it's not just the guests, it's not just you and me, but this was set up to be a community forum. And I definitely think we've achieved that.
Absolutely. Again, the dialogue that they provide, you know, in order to facilitate that to our guests is crucially important. So again, thanks to them, because it is that it gives you the feeling of that interactive, almost as if we're at a town hall, if you will. You know, we've got panelists, we've got some people who are listening who have questions, and we pose those questions, and we're just merely the facilitators, if you will. So I think that we're doing, you know, the vision that we had for this platform is certainly coming to form. And having said all of that, we have to extend our greatest gratitude to News for continuing this platform. As we work with, I think everybody's, you know, coming to grips that there's going to be new technology. We've seen some of our guests with earbuds. You have, for example, the AirPods with the cords. We've seen Ms. Smith, who had the old school, you know, headphones over the head. You know, but one thing has been constant is that we're all adjusting to technology. Some of the times I've popped off on the internet. So, you know, I've had to re-log in. You know, some of our guests have had glitches. For example, we didn't know that if you were in the same room, there's an echo, you know, with the nurses last week. Today with the finance minister, we had seen where, you know, he wasn't able to, you know, hear us. Some of our questions fell off.
Right. And he delay in the show starting because we were setting up and preparing for that. So
no, exactly. And I know that there's, you know, we often look at this and say, well, you know, we look at BBC or CNN and the other news and see what, you know, the end product is, but there's a lot in going to a lot that goes into rather having a show like this. So we'd like to express our extreme gratitude to News for the hard work that they play. And
Pringle said those were an old school headphones. They were the Beats with the noise canceling technology. You're out of date, Eron, today.
well, maybe I am, but what I was referring to is that's an old school style to me. That's how I look. That's how I look at it. But They may be newer than my headphones. That's the reality of it. But we're all seeing the point really that we're making here is that we're all adjusting to it differently. You know, for example, you know, again, just having this discussion on a phone changes the dynamic of the structure of how we come across on this screen. So we all play a part in it. And I think all of that, all of what we've just said is a thanks to our guests, because they have to be patient during that as we work through these issues and the like. But I think that
I was just going to say, I think this is a great point to wrap up on.
Yeah.
We've just hit 1 hour and 30 minutes. That's consistent with our previous shows. We've had some great conversation today. So we'd like to thank again the Honorable Curtis Dickinson, JP MP, the Minister of Finance, for giving some of his time to us and the general public today. It's one thing to have him doing a press statement or having a platform, but it's another thing when you have two people like us going back and forth and picking his brain. And I think they appreciate that as well, you know. So thanks to him. Thanks to Ms. Erica Smith, the Executive Director of the BEDC, Bermuda Economic Development Corporation. And again, thanks to the guests and thanks to Burn News.
Yeah, Ryan. And one thing I do want to recognize the opposition member MP here who just left the comment here, Miss Patricia Gordon-Pamplin. And I say that, right, because it's important, this platform, to bring everybody on all sides of the table together so that we can have this dialogue and this discussion. So again, thanks to Ms. Gordon-Pamplin for tuning in and to all of our guests. But I think now is the appropriate time until Thursday. We'll be back again. Or is it Thursday today? I'm losing track.
Thursday today. The days are going. So we'll see everybody on Tuesday.
There you go.
Time. We're looking forward to your comments and feedback as usual. Thank you very much to the public. Thank you to Burn News for this platform. Our condolences to all those who have been affected, and sympathies to all those who have been affected by COVID-19. Thanks to our essential workers, and thanks to all of you. So we'll see you again next week.